In the year 897, a pope was dragged out of his grave, dressed in his old robes, and forced to sit through a criminal trial in front of an audience of bishops. He had been dead for several months. His body was decomposing. He could not speak in his own defense. The trial proceeded anyway, and the verdict was guilty. This event, known as the Cadaver Synod, is one of the strangest moments in religious history, and the political games behind it shaped the early medieval Catholic Church in ways that still echo today. If you have ever assumed that the medieval Catholic Church operated with quiet dignity, this story is going to rearrange that picture. The papacy in the 9th and 10th centuries was a chaotic, violent institution. Popes rose and fell based on which Roman noble family currently controlled the city. Murders, exile, and forced retirements were normal. The Cadaver Synod was an extreme example of a pattern that defined church politics for almost a century. And it remains the most theatrical version of a political grudge match in Christian history. Here is what actually led up to the trial. Pope Formosus had been a controversial figure during his reign. He had supported certain political factions in the constant battles between European rulers, particularly involving the Holy Roman Empire and rival claimants to royal power. When he died, his enemies finally had a chance to settle old scores. The new Pope Stephen VI came to power with strong backing from factions that had hated Formosus, and he decided that simply ignoring his predecessor was not enough. He wanted the dead Pope put on trial. You should know how the trial itself was staged. Stephen VI ordered the body of Formosus exhumed from the tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. The decomposing corpse was dressed in full papal vestments, complete with the mitre and other ceremonial garments. It was then propped up on a throne in the basilica. A deacon was assigned to stand behind the body and provide answers on its behalf during the proceedings. The image of a court of bishops calmly questioning a corpse, with a frightened deacon speaking in a false voice from behind the chair, is one of the most disturbing scenes ever recorded in religious history. Stay with this, because the charges against the dead pope were almost as strange as the trial itself. Formosus was accused of unlawfully holding the papacy, of moving between bishoprics in violation of church rules, and of various political crimes connected to his support of specific rulers. None of these charges had anything to do with morality or theology, in the way modern readers might expect. They were technical violations of ecclesiastical law, dredged up specifically to destroy the legitimacy of his entire reign. Now think about the consequences if the trial succeeded. Every act Formosus had performed as pope, every ordination, every blessing, every appointment would be retroactively invalidated. The bishops he had consecrated would lose their positions. The marriages and orders he had blessed would be in legal limbo. The political alliances he had built would crumble. This was the real reason for the trial. It was a tool to wipe out the entire institutional legacy of a previous pope and replace it with a new political order. Here is how the verdict came down. The court found Formosus guilty on all counts. His body was stripped of its papal vestments. The 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers he had used to give blessings, were cut off and discarded. His remains were dragged through Rome and eventually thrown into the Tiber River. Every appointment he had made during his papacy was declared void. The damage to the institutional church was enormous, and the chaos created by invalidating an entire pope's body of work took years to untangle. You should also know what happened to Pope Stephen VI, the man who organized this trial. Rome did not take it well. The public was disturbed by the spectacle. Powerful families that had supported Formosus turned against Stephen within months. A popular uprising broke out, and Stephen was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually strangled in his cell less than a year after the Cadaver Synod. His own papacy was declared illegitimate by later popes, and his body, like the one he had put on trial, was eventually moved without ceremony to an unknown location. Stay with this part, because the rehabilitation of Formosus is just as wild as his trial. The pope who succeeded Stephen quickly reversed the verdict of the Cadaver Synod. Formosus was returned to his original tomb, his vestments were restored, his acts as pope were declared valid again, but the next pope after that reversed the reversal. Then the next pope reversed that again. The legitimacy of Formosus bounced back and forth across multiple papacies before the Church finally settled on declaring him a valid pope and pretending the Cadaver Synod had never happened. Now consider what this whole episode tells you about the medieval papacy. The institution was deeply embedded in the political battles of its time. Popes were chosen, deposed, and murdered based on which noble family was currently powerful in Rome. The line between religious authority and political theater was almost non-existent. The Cadaver Synod was an extreme moment, but it sat inside a century of similar madness that historians call the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy. Here is something else worth knowing. The Cadaver Synod produced a long-term reform movement inside the Church. Later generations of clergy looked back at the event with horror and used it as an argument for reducing the political power of secular rulers over papal elections. Reform movements that eventually transformed the Church in the 11th and 12th centuries traced part of their inspiration back to the chaos of this period. The corpse trial, in a strange way, helped push the Church toward the more disciplined institution it would eventually become. The Cadaver Synod also has a deeply human side. The deacon forced to speak for the corpse stands out as one of history's most unfortunate figures, trapped in a ritual even its organizers seemed uncomfortable with. Accounts suggest unease and fear ran through the entire courtroom, with bishops participating out of obligation rather than conviction. The event also lingered in medieval art and writing, where it became a symbol of corruption and misplaced power. The image of a dead pope on trial evolved into a warning about what happens when politics overtakes religion. In the end, the story survived because it was too strange to forget. It reminds us that history is rarely clean or simple. Often it is unsettling, human, and far stranger than textbooks suggest. It also shows how power can distort even basic moral instincts, forcing people into roles they would never freely choose. Silence and compliance often replaced resistance in moments like these, and over time, those uneasy choices became part of the historical record itself. What makes it more haunting is how ordinary the people involved likely were outside that moment. They were not monsters, but officials caught in a collapsing political order. History remembers the spectacle more than the hesitation behind it, and that gap holds the real human story. That is why the Cadaver Synod still unsettles modern readers. It shows how institutions can demand participation even when conscience resists. It lingers because fear often overrides morality in moments of pressure. The details change across history, but the behavior does not.